Hello everyone, and thanks for tuning in on a new episode of Emergente. This is a web series where we try to highlight the strong work cooperation and boundaries between Australia and Latin American countries. Now, if this is the first time you're tuning in to a new episode of Emergente, let me tell you that this is basically an initiative that aims to build a roadmap towards a stronger cooperation between the regions throughout the next generation of leaders. Now, as we all, COVID-19 has hit us hard and it has spread throughout the world, forcing entire communities to stay home and many lockdowns. So still, we have decided to use this channel not only to keep each other's company, but to also keep on learning from one another. Now, today, we are delighted to have here with us Libby Lyons, who is the director of the Australian government Workplace Gender Equality Agency, and therefore is in charge and responsible for promoting and improving gender equality in Australian workplaces. So first of all, Libby, how are you today?
I'm really well. I'm in Perth in Western Australia, and it's just after 7 o'clock in the evening, and it is just a thrill to be with you and talking to you this evening, our time, this morning, your time.
Yeah, it's morning time for me. So once again, thank you for making this possible. You know how hard it is to make agendas work when we live so far away from one another. Now, I think before we get started, it will be mandatory to ask. So Libby, you, as we just said, you are the director of the Workplace Gender Equality Agency in Australia. Now, can you tell us a little bit more about the agency, how it was established, and the core mission?
So the Workplace Gender Equality Agency was established as a result of the Workplace Gender Equality Act 2012. Australia is an interesting place because we've actually been collecting information about what's been happening in workplaces in terms of gender since the 1970s. Whilst some of that information that we were collecting was mandatory, there was no standardisation around the data we collected. But in 2012, as a result of the Workplace Gender Equality Act, all employers in the private sector in Australia with more than 100 employees were mandated under this legislation to report into us every year. And every year they must report in on 6 gender equality indicators. Those indicators include things such as the work that women and men do in workplaces, so that the jobs, the occupations that they have, the money, the salaries that they pay these people, the percentage of women and men on their boards or their governing bodies, the percentage, the policies and strategies that they have in place to support employees with caring responsibilities, how they engage with their employees and communicate with their employees about gender equality in their workplace, and also what they're doing in terms of workplace sex-based harassment and discrimination. I think I've got all 6. I might have forgotten one, but these things that we collect information on are based on research that tells us that if you collect data around this information, and if you then target actions to improve things around, for instance, the percentage of women on boards, you will actually drive better gender equality outcomes.
That's excellent, actually. So, for example, you were telling me that the act took place in 2012, right? That's right. What changes, what positive changes, positive outcomes have you seen ever since?
So as a result, and I guess this is the beauty of the Act and the beauty of the agency, we're a regulator, but through this data, through the data we collect and then report on every year, we also use the information and the analysis that we get from the data to educate and inform and work with employers to ensure that they can achieve better gender balance in their organisations. So we're not just a regulator, we're an educator. We inform, we consult, we do all of those things. So where have we seen improvements? Well, we've seen the gender pay gap drop every year that we've been collecting data. It's still far too high, but we have seen it drop. We now have, so if you think that more than 10,000 organisations report into us every year, we cover over 40% of all employees in Australia. So of those 10,000 plus organisations, 3/4 of them now have a gender equality strategy or policy in place. 3/4 of them. So that is fantastic. We're really pleased about that. We now also have nearly 3/4 of all employers with a policy or strategy around flexible work. So there's some of the things that we've seen improvements in. We've seen improvements in the percentage of organisations who were providing support for employees who may be affected by domestic violence. This year, in our data set, I think it was up at around 60% of all organisations now have a policy or strategy in place to support those that may be affected by domestic or family violence. That went up, that figure went up by nearly 14 percentage points just in 1 year. And interestingly too, 1/3 of our organisations that report into us now offer paid leave for those who are affected by domestic or family violence. And there's one other thing that I want to talk to you about, which I think is absolutely fantastic. This year, our data told us that if we look at all managers across our data set, 39.4% of all managers in Australia today in the private sector are women. And last year, 43.8% of all promotions into management went to women. Now, based on this data and based on that trend, if that trend continues, in 20 years in Australia, we will have gender balance at most levels of management in Australia. Yeah.
Wow. I know that sounds like a lot of time, but we know that that's actually non-time at all, given the history we have. I think in Argentina, the actual data shows that if we keep going at this pace, we'll reach gender equality at workplaces in like 190 years, something like that. So good job, please.
That's just for managers, but that is good because we know that in order to achieve gender balance at lower levels of the organisation, you've got to get that pipeline strong. So we know that the pipeline is strong. That's fantastic.
That's fantastic. And actually, you mentioned a couple bullet points that I'm going to stick with them for right now for a minute. Quite some interesting comments. So, for example, you mentioning these promotions on middle range and higher range level positions. And I did my research, I did my homework, and apparently the information I got is that current research shows that promoting sponsorship rather than mentoring initiatives actually fosters women's career development in a more secure and fastest way. What are your viewpoints about this topic? And also, is the agency promoting this, or is this something that doesn't actually concern you all?
So we know that sponsorship and mentorship are both very, very important. But sponsorship is far more important because sponsorship means that if you are sponsoring women within your organisation, or men for that matter, but if you're sponsoring somebody in an organisation, you actually advocate for that person when they're not there. And that's why it's really important that we see women move into the upper levels of management in an organisation, because they then become, if you like, automatic sponsors for all of the women who report into them and those women further down the career ladder. So that sponsorship is important because it means that there is someone advocating for that person when that person is not necessarily there. There are so many decisions made about succession planning and where employees should go in an organisation when the employee is not there. So you need somebody to sponsor you. You need somebody who knows what you have done, what you are doing, but more importantly, what your aspirations are and what you're capable of doing. And that's why sponsorship is really, really important. Let's not forget mentoring. Mentoring is great too. And formal mentoring programs can be fantastic. But we know full well that if you have sponsorship programs in place, if you set targets to achieve better outcomes in terms of gender balance at different manager levels, at different occupations, then these things combined with ensuring that people get learning and development opportunities, you will see more women climb that career ladder. It will happen. And we know that when we have more women at the top of an organisation, you get more women in the lower levels of the organisation as well.
That's very interesting. And I also read that the agency promotes gender-blind hiring and promotion processes. And therefore, you mentioned previously that you also work with, all this public reporting that you get from top companies. Have organizations actually implemented this kind of recruiting, and what actions do you actually take to encourage this behavior from them? And actually, do you have data showing that this actually turn out with more women being employed?
We don't actually have any data that tells us that more women at this stage are being employed, but we certainly have the information around recruitment. And I think it's really very important when you come to recruitment that we recognise that we all have bias within us. We all have our biases. And so the important thing is when you're looking at recruitment, there are a few important things that you need to do. And it starts from the moment you might advertise the position. It's essential when you are advertising positions that you use gender neutral language, that you don't use language that is automatically going to attract more men than women. So, for instance, we know that when you're talking in an advertisement about experience, that men will look at something and think that they have, 4 out of the 5 skills or experience required and say, yeah, I'm going to apply for that job, I'll get that job. Women might look at it and say have 8 or 9 out of the 10 things that are being listed and go, oh, golly, I haven't got all the experience and skills, I won't apply for that job. So when you're doing a job advertisement, for instance, don't talk about experience and skills so much, talk about outcomes. In this job, these are the outcomes that we expect. And if you start talking about outcomes, both women and men can identify with that, and you won't exclude 50% of the population in wanting to apply. Other things too are to make sure that internally you are monitoring who is being invited for interview. We all know, for instance, that we tend to favour those who look and sound like us, those who might have gone to the same university or the same school or live in our area. We tend to favour those people. So if when people are looking at CVs or resumes as they're coming in, and they can see that somebody went to the same university at them, they will, without really knowing, show a bias towards that person. So having things in place where you can, software packages, for instance, that take out that sort of information about where people are educated, what their gender is, that blind recruiting is very, very important. Other things too are things like ensuring that you have very structured interviews, that you are actually asking the same questions of all candidates, and that you are assessing them on the same set of criteria, because otherwise, again, biases can creep in. And I tell the story about my own bias. So I discovered an unconscious bias that I had one day when I moved to a new city, and I had to find a doctor, a GP. And somebody told me that there was a good GP practice and to ring and make an appointment. And when I rang to make the appointment, the lovely lady on the other end said, yes, we can give you an appointment with Dr. Sally Sievers tomorrow. And I was taken aback, and I went, oh, don't you have a male doctor? Until this point, I did not realise that I had this unconscious bias where my standard go-to was a male doctor. I had an unconscious bias against female doctors. Now, that doesn't actually hurt me unless I find a really bad male doctor. But if I'm on the board of a hospital and part of my role is interviewing potential doctors and medical staff, I need to be very aware that my bias will automatically tend to favour male doctors or male medical professionals. So in knowing that bias, I need to be honest about it, and I would need to say to my fellow board members, you need to understand I have a bias towards male doctors. You must challenge me on questions I ask and decisions I make to ensure that I am looking at the person for who they are and what they can bring to our organisation. So those sorts of things are really important.
Yeah, I think we all have biases, and it's an everyday work to get to know them better. Like, you know, for example, you'll be out doing something and you will say something, you will think something, and then you will realize, wait, what am I thinking? What am I saying? And there's no perfection. We're just humans, and we belong to a society that has shaped us in what we are for many centuries. And yeah, it's tough work, but we just gotta keep working on it. I think it's the only way forward to get to a more equitable society for all of us.
And now, it's really, can I just do one more thing?
Yeah, so sure.
We've worked really closely in the past with the UK and their Gender Equalities Office, and they actually did some research and found that doing training for employees on unconscious bias can work, but it can also have the opposite effect, because if you do unconscious bias training, particularly if it's online training, and you tick, 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 and then you get to the end and you go, yes, you've completed the course, you now know, you've completed your your unconscious bias training. Employees then think, gee, I'm okay now, I don't have any unconscious biases, and they leave it at that and they forget about it. So that sort of training isn't often always helpful. It's understanding who you are, as you were just saying, and that without knowing, these things come out, or we say these things, and we have to stop ourselves. So we have to be very cognizant of the fact that we have these biases, and that we must check ourselves all the time, particularly if we are looking at salary negotiations, promotions and recruitment.
Totally. I completely agree with you, Libby, on that. Previously, you were mentioning, and I know the agency actually pushes for men engagement in more flexible work, so they can actually also share the responsibilities that come with a house. And we know that for centuries, domestic work has been seen as unpaid job, and we call them love, but it's not love. It is what it is. It's unpaid job. And I know many countries nowadays actually also push for, men taking a same parental leave amount of time of women, but some they do not. And sometimes in some societies, I'm not saying all of them, but we know that in some societies, men actually are looked down when doing domestic chores, which, silly, but still happens. So what initiatives, what's the viewpoint of the agency on trying to, get rid of this misperception of what work belongs to each gender or not?
So most certainly, because women engage in more unpaid care and domestic work than men, women simply don't have the hours that men have to dedicate to a job, a paid job or career. So in Australia today, for every hour of unpaid care and domestic work that men do, women are doing an hour and 46 minutes. And until we close that gap, right, that's in Australia, and we're doing okay, but that's still a huge gap. Women are still doing a lot more of the unpaid care and domestic work. And anecdotally, I can tell you that during this time of COVID, it's become even worse, that women are bearing even more of that unpaid care and domestic work burden. So in order to address it, we need to actually change our culture. And changing culture is really, really hard. But if we can start in the workplace by introducing and ensuring that men have access to flexible work, that will be an important step forward. Unfortunately, in 2016, an organisation here called Chief Executive Women and Bain & Co. did some research that told us that men were twice as likely to have their requests for flexible work denied as women. On top of that, they felt that they were being judged as not being serious about their career if they did request to work flexibly. Now, we've got to get rid of these ideas that men working flexibly, men supporting and being an active parent is not the manly thing to do, and that you're not serious about your career. This is nonsense. Children need parents in their lives. They don't just need a mother, and they don't just need a father. They need both their parents. And if both parents are of the same sex, they need both of those parents in their lives, and they need them both to be active. Because that is the only way we are going to bring up a new generation of children that grow into adults who do. The fact that we have nearly 3/4 of all our employers with a with a flexible work policy or strategy in place is fantastic. But if we think and if we know that the key to reducing this disparity of unpaid care and working hours that women do compared to men, if we know that access to flexible work for men is the key to changing that, then employers need to start taking things a bit more seriously, and they need to put targets in place for the take-up of flexible work, particularly of men. And last year, our data told us that just over 2% of organisations, of those 72% of organisations who have a policy in place, just over 2% of those had bothered to put a target in place to get men working flexibly. So it's okay to have the policy and strategy, but you've got to take action. And taking action often means putting targets in place.
Targets, yeah.
That's what we have to do. And when you put a target in place, you must make people accountable for achieving those targets. And it's through targets that you will start getting the cultural change in your workplace that you need. Paid parental leave is also really very, very important. You will be surprised to learn that over half of the organisations that report into us offer no paid parental leave. And it often depends on the size of the organisation and the industry that you're in as to whether or not you're offered paid parental leave as an employee. So there is a lot of discrimination when it comes to paid parental leave in Australia, and certainly the leading organisations who understand the importance of paid parental leave are now starting to introduce schemes where women and men are not discriminated against as parents, that women and men both have equal access to paid parental leave. And in doing that, we are seeing the sharing of care, and we're seeing this allow women to be more actively engaged in the workforce. Because if you think about it this way, Facundo, if men do not have access to parental leave, what choice does that give their partner? None. It takes away their choice to work. So it's very important.
Yeah, I think it's crystal clear right there. It is. Thanks again. Now, I know that due to your work, you focus mainly on the things that happen in Australia and the workplace in Australia. But I know that you have traveled to Argentina in 2018 to be a delegate of the W20, which is the Women's Summit of the G20. And I know you have a special story about Argentina yourself. I don't know if you want to dip into that, but I have to ask you, I'm from Argentina, so I would like to know what was your experience like at G20, and how do you actually see the organization advancing on the agenda of women?
I think Argentina is like many, many countries in the world, and not unlike Australia, we've got a long way to go. We've started to make steps, but we've got many, many more steps to take before we get to gender equity, gender equality. I think Australia is unique because we are the only country collecting this, the depth and breadth of data around gender equality, and we can see that it's working because we see most of our indicators improving. And I believe that we have to share that. We have to share our unique model with other countries. Collecting mandatory data around this does prove that what gets measured gets managed. If you shine a spotlight on something and that spotlight shows up that something isn't as good as it could be, that is a great thing to get action happening. And this is what we've proved in setting up the Workplace Gender Equality Agency. Argentina has additional problems that Australia doesn't have because you have a very big informal workforce, particularly in home care and domestic work and things like that, where women are employed in an informal way. And so we don't have that problem here in Australia. So you have an added dimension to your gender equality problem that needs to be given special thought and special action. But that thought that needs to go into it will only happen successfully if you have diversity in the people who are making your decisions. So like any country in the world, we need to ensure that the people that represent us in government represent the communities in which we live. We don't want all politicians or all public servants to look and sound like me. That would be terrible. There would be no creative thought. There would be, no different thinking in what we do. And that's why gender equality is important. Argentina has this informal workplace which makes it difficult. You do, however, have quite good representation of women in politics, and that's great. But again, what we need to do is, until you start actually collecting data and measuring what's happening, you don't actually know what is happening in your workplaces. You can guess, you can have a fair idea, but until you actually start collecting that data, you actually don't have an idea. And the thing that we have discovered is that people will listen if you have data and statistics. The business case for gender equality is very, very clear. It's very clear. You have better gender balance, you have diversity and inclusion, you get increased employee engagement, improved employee loyalty, you get better thinking, you get more creative in the way that you do things, but you also can improve your bottom line. And that's what all businesses want. We want better bottom lines. We want to return better returns to shareholders. You need diversity to do that. And so I guess that the important thing, the one thing that if Argentina could just start, even if it started with the top 200 companies and started collecting the data, if they got together collectively and started providing the data around who was working in their employment, their gender, the salaries they were being paid, so you could get some statistics, I think that would start to drive change. Smart employers get gender equality. The smart employers are more competitive than others in their industry because they're doing better because they have gender balance. We need to somehow start garnering that, getting that support happening in Argentina to see it moving.
Yeah, you know, for example, I'm not going to be talking about the private sector, but the public sector is actually waking up in Argentina, if you ask me. I know I'm interviewing you, but let me chip in this comment, because 5 years ago we had such a tragedy. A young woman named Micaela was killed, and the country went mayhem about it. Years after that, a new bill took discussion inside the parliament, and a new law called the Micaela Law was approved by all of the members of the chamber. No one voted against it, and it actually established mandatory gender classes for all the members of the 3 different branches of power. So people in the justice branch have to take lessons on gender equality. People that work already in the Congress, they have to take it. People from the executive branch, they have to take it. And I think that's a good start. We will see if we can push the agenda over the private sector as well, but I think that's actually quite interesting. And I don't know if all the countries or many other countries are doing the same to their public officials.
That's fantastic. There's one observation I'd make about the W20, and I think that, and it's this, and that is, from my perspective, the people that you had involved in presenting represented the Americas, North and South Americas. And I think that we have to think beyond that. We have to think beyond the geographical area in which we live. And that's why I have been, I've done a lot of work with Chile, for instance, and that's why I really enjoyed coming to Argentina and meeting with some of your lawmakers and your employers to talk about what we're doing in Australia. And that's why I think this initiative that you have going with the younger people is fantastic, because we can learn so much from each other. And after all, we're all in the Southern Hemisphere. And that's important. That can bind us together. But I think we have to start looking beyond our geographical area to learn more about what others are doing. And that was the one thing that I found very interesting about the W20 was it was focusing on the Americas, and it wasn't it didn't seem to me to embrace Asia, Europe and other countries as much as it did the Americas. And I think that if there was a failing in it, and I'm not saying it failed at all, but if there was some advice I could give, it would be look beyond the Americas. And that's precisely what you people are doing. You guys are doing in your group. And I think that is wonderful. It's so important.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Libby. Now, I don't want to take much of your time. I know it's getting late for you in Australia right now. But Libby, I have to ask you one more thing. You have had an extraordinary career. You keep on moving forward. I don't know what your next challenge is going to be. I'm sure it's going to be something amazing. But to all the people listening to us right now throughout the web, what advice would you have on young women and young men who actually want to make a positive contribution to the world throughout their actions and their work?
So I think there are a couple of things I'd say. The first one is you must always be true to yourself. You must always be true to yourself. And if you see something that makes you feel uncomfortable, you must speak about it and you must speak up about it. It comes with a health warning because sometimes, particularly in your career, it can be career limiting. And I've lost jobs for speaking up about things that are wrong. But it didn't stop me. I kept going, and I think that's important. And I think the other thing to say is grasp every opportunity that comes your way. If an opportunity comes your way, even if you're scared about taking that opportunity or you don't think that you have the capability to do it, grasp the opportunity. Don't, if it knocks on your door, don't say, oh, I'm so sorry, I've got to wash my hair, I can't do this, or I've still got my pajamas on, come back tomorrow. Don't do that. Grasp the opportunities that come to you and use those opportunities to help one another. Because remember, anything that I've done in my career, I've done through having people help me. And so what I try and do now is help anybody that I can, because I wouldn't have got there without the help of women and men, without the help of my family. And so it's important to remember, yes, there's a path I want to take, and that's fine, but don't ignore people along the way. Help people, because in helping people, they help you. And I think that's really, really important. But the most important thing I think is being true to yourself.
Amazing, amazing. Thank you. Thank you so much, Libby, for your time today. Thank you again for all your hard work building a safer and stronger workplace for everyone out there in Australia. I hope that the rest of the world, including us, Argentinians, will catch on that tendency rather sooner than later. But I know we will. I'm positive about it. And it sure was a positive talk, a wonderful conversation that keeps on showing how much we have in common, even though you guys move way more advanced, way faster towards the ultimate goal of equality. But it also shows how we countries can keep on working together, even though we are literally on the other side of the world. Now, once again, thank you, Libby. Thanks everyone else who's watching. Please stay home, be safe. For everyone else out there who's watching and have liked this video, would like to know more about the cooperation and the things we're doing in order to strengthen the cooperation between Australian and Latin American countries. Please subscribe, stay tuned, and have a good night or a good day. Goodbye. Thank you.